Europe needs to do more to defend itself, and Germany is a huge part of it. If Europe wants to be able to defend itself, it needs Germany.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
The IDF will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battlelines. It's Friday, 7th of November, 2025. Germany is rearming, and fast. It's a sentence that would have been impossible to imagine just a decade ago. And a few decades before that, hearing such a thing might well have sent shivers down your spine. But today we live in a different world. A world where Russia's war machine is up and running, and it poses a threat to all of Europe. Germany is a central cog in the continent's defence, and after a few stumbling years, it is finally rising to the challenge. Germany is set to reach the NATO defence spending target of 3.5% in 2029, long before the UK. The country's defence purchases last year added up to more than 3 times the combined amount spent by Britain, France and Poland. And last week saw a leaked list of more than €350 billion worth of planned military purchases emerge in the media. It's a startling turnaround for a nation whose armed forces were once the butt of jokes across Europe. So on today's episode, I'll be asking, why has it taken so long? What exactly is Germany buying? And is it enough? I'm joined by our Berlin correspondent James Rothwell and Ulrike Franke, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations who specialises in Germany. James, Ulrike, thank you very much for coming on Battlelines. I want to start in 2014 with that now legendary story of Germany's Panzer Grenadier Battalion 371 Brigade and the Brooms. James, can you tell us this story?
Notoriously, or somewhat notoriously, back in 2014, the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces, were taking part in an exercise where they basically turned up with broomsticks painted black instead of machine guns on their troop carrier vehicles, which caused a bit of a stink at the time. It's an anecdote that's been used, many, many times since in order to kind of illustrate some of the very serious shortages in equipment that the Bundeswehr have had over the years. And it's an anecdote that's being mentioned a lot in the current discussion about rearmament, because of course it is happening. Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, has got this very sort of bold ambition of turning the Bundeswehr into, as he says, Europe's strongest conventional army. People talk about this anecdote a lot recently to try and illustrate not the changes that have happened, because this is very much an ongoing project, the rearmament, but it's certainly trying to illustrate the relatively poor state of equipment that the Bundeswehr suffered from quite recently.
Ulrike, how bad were things? Can you give us a sense of how much Germany had let its armed forces deteriorate by the early 2010s?
I think it wasn't, to some extent, still is pretty bad. I mean, this is a kind of funny anecdote with the broomstick, although a rather sad one when you think about it. But it is true that for a few decades, Germany really had underinvested in its armed forces, simply because we thought we didn't really need them anymore, and there wasn't much support by the public to be spending any money on the military. It felt as if, wars were a thing of the past. Even the idea of having military means for deterrence or to have a seat at the table was something that wasn't really part of the German mindset. For quite a few years, we had underinvestment, things get old, weren't replaced. The official goal was not to have enough equipment for the soldiers. So we didn't have full equipment, as we call it now. We had about 70 or 80% of necessary equipment. So very practically, if you had 100 soldiers, you only had 70 or 18, say, rifles or things like that. Which is why, even though we're now talking about large sums of money being spent for German rearmament, I think we're still almost in the kind of re-equipment part of the cycle, where we just kind of get what we should have anyway. This is why we're talking about so much money, and why there seems to be stuff missing pretty much everywhere and not just in specific areas.
Okay, so Germany is still trying to get back to zero, and that's arguments that we've heard made of the UK's armed forces too, after so many years of the peace dividend, so to speak. Let's fast forward to when Russia invades Ukraine in February 2022. Olaf Scholz at the time declares what will later become known as Zeitenwende, the turning point. And he says, we're living through a watershed era, and that means the world afterwards will no longer be the same as the world before. And he expresses this intention to rebuild Germany's army. How significant was this moment for Germany? James, what was it like reporting on that?
Well, it was definitely a very significant moment. I mean, the Zeitenwende speech was an opportunity, I suppose, politically for Olaf Scholz to try and turn a page, basically, to announce that Germany was going to become more hawkish on European security affairs than it had ever been in response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. However, many of the pledges of the Zeitenwende speech did not come to fruition. I mean, critics of Olaf Scholz would say, that this turned out to be a chancellor who, while making some very generous financial contributions to Ukraine, was, they would say, terrified of escalation with Russia. We remember that long, meandering argument about whether or not to send Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Mr. Scholz was frequently accused of using concerns about provoking or angering Russia as a pretext not to give certain types of support to Ukraine, which his allies in NATO felt were necessary at the time. I don't want to be too unfair on Olaf Scholz, because while there was a sort of rather sluggish initial response to the request for military support, the Scholz government ended up being hugely generous to Ukraine. But I think in terms of rhetoric and in terms of policy, and I'm very curious to hear what Ulrike's perspective on this is as well, I think it's probably fair to say that Friedrich Merz has offered much, much bigger, more transformative policies in terms of Zeitenwende. The German government has created a 500 billion euro special fund, Sondervermögen, which is designed to rebuild Germany's crumbling road and rail infrastructure, which would be very important if war broke out with Russia. It would be used to transit tanks and troops to the front. Part of the Merz government's Zeitenwende policy, if we want to sort of compare the two, is this idea that major defence projects that cost more than 1% of GDP in Germany would be exempt from spending limits. So we're talking about potentially unlimited spending in Germany on defence projects, potentially. And that's a major shift from Olaf Scholz. The big criticism of Olaf Scholz was that he talked a good game on Zeitenwende, but it didn't really come to fruition. And there's now a lot of expectation about what Friedrich Merz is going to do.
Ulrike, I want to get your thoughts on that. But I also want to push back on this idea that Scholz was all walk and no talk, because that was certainly the narrative around him. But I was reading an excellent piece by Matt Oliver, our industry editor, who was talking about various procurements. And we obviously have lots of data for 2024, which would have all been done under Scholz. Ordered 123 Boxer armoured transport vehicles, 265 protected trucks, 19 Sky Ranger mobile air defence turrets, a 58 billion euro spending spree, according to data compiled by the Kiel Institute, and also an order of up to 1,000 American-made Patriot missiles. Doesn't that suggest that, yes, it took him a while to get going, but that is how it always is when you're trying to turn the armed forces of a country? It's like turning an oil tanker. It takes a while to gear things up. Ulrike, what do you think?
First of all, I think it really is important to note how much of an earthquake this Zeitenwende speech, 3 days after the Russian full invasion in Ukraine, so on the 27th of February 2022, was for German society, for the German mindset. And it really kind of rang in a new era in terms of how Germany even discusses military and the armed forces and all of that. And I remember it being really, really striking because, I've been working on these topics for well over a decade. And in one speech, the Chancellor basically just kind of found a way to just do a number of things we had been discussing for years and years, procurement of F-35 jets for NATO nuclear sharing. So there really was a question whether Germany would, accidentally drop out of NATO nuclear sharing. So the idea that Germany has nuclear weapons, US nuclear weapons, that it would carry on German airplanes in case of an attack, just because we didn't have the airplanes anymore. And the coalition, like Scholz's Social Democrat coalition, wasn't quite willing to even address this. And so, among experts, there really was a fear we may not be able to continue NATO nuclear sharing anymore because we don't have the airplanes. And in the speech, he just said, okay, let's go for the F-35. We're going to do it. Armed drones, similar discussion. We talked about it for ages. He just goes, okay, let's do it. So on one hand, it really was an earthquake. On the other hand, in the speech, you have the line literally saying, we need aircraft, military aircraft that fly. We need military submarines that can dive. So it kind of shows you where are we starting from? That seems to be a very low bar to set. But it really was a watershed moment. And the problem in a way was that, yes, he went out with this strong rhetoric, and then very little seemed to have happened. I've talked to the industry that said we were basically there from day one and said we can start now, and then we didn't hear from the German government for like 6 months. To some extent, the German defense minister at the time was to blame. Christine Lambrecht, who really is seen as someone who didn't manage to get Zeitenwende on track, so to speak, and we had to wait for Boris Pistorius, the current defense minister, who was already defense minister under Olaf Scholz, who seems to be much better in actually getting things done.
So Scholz loses the election at the beginning of this year. Friedrich Merz is elected in his place. He doesn't become chancellor for another couple of months. And in the midst of that, you have the election of Trump, and he comes in and you have this awful confrontation in the Oval Office with Zelensky. And it becomes very clear, I think, to all European leaders that America is serious about pulling back from Europe and leaving Europe to deal with the situation in Ukraine on its own. How much of that was a rocket booster for Friedrich Merz, or did he already come in thinking, I've got to take this more seriously than Scholz and I'm going to throw everything at it? James, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. There was a moment on election night in February that I think really illustrated the dilemma that Germany and frankly all NATO allies face at the moment in the face of the Trump administration. It was shortly after the exit poll had come out, and Friedrich Merz, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but Friedrich Merz basically said, we've got to accept a new reality where we can't necessarily depend on America to come to the rescue. And he was, of course, referring to the Trump administration and comments that the Trump administration at the time had made about NATO and defense. This, of course, is also against a backdrop where J.D. Vance, the vice president, came to Munich Security Conference just before the election. Everyone had been waiting with bated breath for him to give some quite strong comments, ideally, about the war with Russia, and he proceeded to kind of clobber everyone with a sort of rather schoolmasterly speech about the erosion of free speech in Europe at a security conference, which I think caught everyone off guard, surprised everyone, and was a bit of a sort of cold water in the face moment for a lot of Germans. They were looking to the Trump administration for some leadership on this issue, and instead they were attacked quite vociferously in terms of their own democratic status. And as a slight aside, by the way, J.D. Vance at Munich Security Conference didn't meet with Olaf Scholz, but he did meet with Alice Weidel, the leader of the far-right AfD party, which is about as strong an indicator as you can get of who at the time the Trump administration wanted to win that election. But back to Friedrich Merz on election night, he said, in as many words, we can't really rely solely on the Americans to come to our defense anymore. And I think that really was him seizing the moment really on election night to make it clear that he is serious about rearmament, because of course the rearmament policy is what followed. The whole point of rearmament is it's a policy that's kind of underpinned by this anxiety that perhaps you can't depend on America in the same way that you used to. And it's underpinned by this idea that the German military system needs to become perhaps not completely independent of America, because that would defeat the point of NATO, but it does need to have, as Ulrike was saying, planes that fly and submarines that can dive. It needs to have a sort of fundamental standing army so that it can fight for itself. And I think it was very significant that he chose to make those remarks on election night, just after the exit poll had come in, before he was actually chancellor. It's difficult, especially for a committed transatlanticist like Friedrich Merz, to say something like that. This is someone who really cherishes the US-Germany relationship, but he was kind of questioning it on election night. I thought it was very significant.
I would say that the slow realization in Germany that we no longer can rely to the same extent as before on the US as our security guarantor, that is really way more significant when it comes to kind of German, let's call it rearmament, than even Russia's invasion in Ukraine was and is. And I would say rightly so, because of course, Russia's invasion in Ukraine is a watershed moment, and it really shows that something has changed in global politics, and it is a war on European soil. And by the way, Kiev really isn't that far from Berlin. This is all very, very relevant. But had this happened in the time where we had the promise of the Americans to kind of always be there for the Europeans, things would have looked differently. But now, in combination with Donald Trump being re-elected a second time, and also importantly, a general change in the US kind of society regarding its willingness to stand up for Europe going forward, even with, say, a Democratic president in the future, This is something that Germany took a while to realize. I mean, Angela Merkel already said at one point, we may not be able to rely on the US to the same extent as before. So this was a kind of a process. But now with Trump, with the speech by Vice President Vance, I was in Munich at the time. I remember like what a bombshell it was. There really is a realization that things have changed. And Germany has relied so much on the US for its security and defense. This is really something that, Brits and also French may not get to the same extent. But the dependency really was and is enormous, and realizing that this no longer works. This doesn't mean that, NATO is over, but that really the premise has changed fundamentally. This is what drives to quite a big extent the current change in German rebuilding of its armed forces and its defense, and the focus on European defense and European solutions to defense challenges.
So Germany, as you guys have mentioned, gets rid of any fiscal restrictions on defense spending. And then Merz comes in and he's drawn up plans to spend massive 377 billion on defense, in addition to Scholz's 100 billion previously. Ulrike, what is this money being spent on, and how much of it is American, from your last question?
Yeah, so we're still kind of waiting for the last list. So this is obviously still ongoing. So I don't have the exact numbers because they're not there yet. But the money is being spent really on all kinds of things, because we're lacking all kinds of things. It is big procurement projects like aircraft, 35 F-35 from the US, and now an additional 15. So this is about guaranteeing nuclear sharing, as I mentioned, and just having aerial capabilities. It is spent on transport helicopters, which is an important one, but it is also spent on kind of equipment and ammunition, kind of smaller pieces. Because again, the plan before wasn't to have full equipment even for the soldiers that we have. So it is spent on almost everything, I want to say. Quite a bit of the money is being spent on US equipment, especially of the original 100 billion. Again, we don't have the exact percentages yet because this is ongoing, but I think it is more than what some people would like. The reason for that is twofold. Number one, it is because some equipment basically is only available from the US. They've developed certain things that you can only buy from them, or that are only available right now from them. This is partly our own fault because we didn't develop it at the European level. But the other reason, of course, is also that there still is this thinking that if you buy from the US, you get a certain, maybe not security guarantee, but you kind of tie the US in, you show them that, yeah, we're willing to spend our money also on your stuff. So please don't leave us. The development, at least, is towards doing more at the European level to try to buy more at the European level and from Europeans to develop more at the European level, although that is very difficult, but at least, buying together and doing more things together. This is something that the Europeans are trying to do. And the EU, the European Union, has become a much more active actor in the whole defense and defense industrial space. It used to be that the EU didn't really touch security and defense for various reasons. And now that has changed, and real money is also being freed up in the European Union to spend on defense and develop defense and all of that. So here also quite a big change. But yeah, the US is obviously still important as a producer and an exporter and as a security guarantor. And that's not something that you can change from one day to the other. And honestly, that at least the Germans don't want to change from one day to the other.
What about indigenously produced bits of kit like the Leopard 2, for example? Are they investing heavily in the supply chains and manufacturing of that?
Yes, if you look at the German defense industrial base and the German defense industry, we have had an enormous rise in actors. I feel that every other week I seem to be talking to a new startup in Germany that is producing drones or counter-drone measures, things like that. We had the big players like Rheinmetall, whose stock rose from, I think, something like €80 per share before the war to 2,500 or something right now. So you can really see how the infusion of money into the system has changed things. Rheinmetall in particular is kind of building up its production capabilities, and it's building new production sites in Germany and elsewhere. So definitely the kind of defense industrial base here really is changing. This certainly also took a while, because the industry doesn't move just because someone tells them that they're going to get money. They move once they get the money or once they have the contracts in place. But no, definitely this has changed. And also, again, with the mindset having changed, that also means that before, say, the Zeitenwende, before the war against Ukraine, the arms industry in Germany was always seen as a bit of like the dirty little secret. It was actually already quite big beforehand. Germany was, I think, somewhere like in the top 5 arms producers and arms exporters, but the political realm didn't acknowledge this. This wasn't something that, was talked about or even liked. And now, the political realm is much more okay to be seen, let's say, with Rheinmetall, to do deals, to show that this is something that Germany also wants to be able to do. So I think there's a big change there. And there's even talk of maybe could the defense industry help German economic development, and could it eventually even replace the car industry, which famously keeps up the German industry? Quite similar to the UK, where we talk about this possibility of a defense dividend, right? There is a similar narrative in Germany as well.
James, what do you think about what Germany is spending this money on? Is there anything they're missing?
That's a really good question. Rheinmetall is definitely a major beneficiary of the spending list that was leaked last week. That's a list of about 377 billion euros worth of kit. And lots of the stuff that's on there, of course, is what you might call conventional weapons, tanks, lots of equipment on air defense as well, and rather interesting plans, at least, for the purchase of 400 Tomahawk Block VB cruise missiles, very powerful long-range missiles. Those have got a range of about 1,000 kilometers, so they could reach Moscow, similar in range actually to the Taurus missile, which is that sort of totemic, powerful German long-range missile that it has so far not given to Ukraine because it fears it would be too great an escalation with Russia. So what's missing there? Well, some in the defense industry have complained that there's not enough drone tech on the German government's military shopping list. They make the argument that if you look at the battlefield on Ukraine, it's basically a drone war. They make the argument that drones are therefore the future of warfare. The people in the defense industry making this criticism, I should stress, are drone producers. So, of course, they have a vested interest in arguing that more funding for drone tech is important. This is quite a fierce debate, I think, at the moment in the German defense industry. I'm actually in the process of speaking to people from that world this week for a story about it. There's a school of thought that says if Germany has to fight a war with Russia, it will be very different from the war in Ukraine, and it will not actually involve as much drone kit and flashy new technology as people assume, and therefore the focus should be on, massive contracts with Rheinmetall and tanks and conventional weaponry. There is another school of thought which says that the nature of warfare and what even counts as a war is changing, and that traditionally we think of a war, perhaps to laymen like me at least, might be two forces meeting on a battlefield and killing each other. Whereas we've seen, for example, in the case of the war between Iran and Israel, that it might actually just be an air war. It might actually just be an exchange of fire that consists of hundreds, if not thousands, of drones on either side. There's a big concern in NATO at the moment about how we intercept drones. When Russian drones were sent over the border into Poland, they were intercepted with powerful NATO fighter jets, effective but eye-wateringly expensive and therefore not cost-efficient way of dealing with drone threats. So a big question at the moment is, how do you deal with cheap, fast to produce, easy to produce Russian drones? There's a bit of a debate, as I understand it, going on in the German defense industry about how, therefore, the shopping list should be split up between sort of traditional weapons and flashy startup kit. But it's very, very much an ongoing conversation, and one that's in relatively early stages.
We're going to take a short pause. Coming up after the break, why Germany's reliance on Chinese rare earths is the elephant in the room. Welcome back. Before we go any further, I'd like to ask you to leave a review for this podcast if you're enjoying it. You can do it underneath this episode on YouTube and Spotify, or on Apple, just go to our main feed and scroll down. It really helps us figure out what you do and don't like and tailor this podcast to your interests. Now, back to the chat with Ulrike and James. There's an elephant in the room here, isn't there? Because all of this stuff, all military kit, relies on rare earths and critical minerals, over which China has a complete stranglehold. And we've seen that in the news recently because China brought in some export restrictions that Trump managed to get rolled back or delayed by a year. But it's caused huge consternation, and rightly so. We did an episode a couple of weeks ago about how China could basically stop the US military in its tracks within a couple of days. If it halts all of these supplies, nothing can be built, nothing can work without all of these rare earths and critical minerals. I know Merz chaired the first ever meeting of the National Security Council yesterday, and dependence on China's supply chain in this was one of the key issues they brought up. Is there a plan in Germany to get around this issue?
I mean, I don't think there's quite yet a full plan, but exactly as you mentioned, I mean, we now have a National Security Council, which was something, again, which was, discussed for ages and ages, and the Merz government now just did it. It's in the Chancellery. It was the first meeting yesterday, so we don't quite know what it's going to look like and what they're going to do, but they met on two issues, as I understand. One, hybrid threats and hybrid warfare from Russia, and two, as you said, kind of rare earths and other supply chain issues. And they developed or are developing a kind of plan on how to move forward with this. So I don't think that there is a full plan yet. And I mean, let's be honest, there is no one solution that you can just come up with, but the realization that these dependencies exist are there. I think this is very good. And by the way, the dependency on China, it's not just about the resources and rare earths and things like that, but it's also about manufacturing capability in general. I mean, let's talk about drones that James mentioned. These kind of small drones that Ukraine is using a lot and Russia is using a lot, if they're being bought as full systems, almost all of them come from China. But even the systems that Ukraine builds itself, and it has become quite a big drone manufacturer, the parts used in the drones are being manufactured in China. And this wouldn't be very different, at least, right now, if we had a war really involving other Europeans. So we really have a big dependency on Chinese manufacturing capabilities, and starting to work around this and rebuilding the European defense industrial base and manufacturing capabilities is also something that we need to do to decrease this dependency and really vulnerability. So I think that, plans on this are being made. Again, there's not going to be the one solution, the one plan that is gonna, as long as we don't find all these rare earths somewhere in Europe, there will be dependencies, but the realization that this is a problem is certainly there, and there are at least plans to there are plans to make a plan.
I mean, I guess in some respects, maybe it doesn't matter. The main pacing threat for the German armed forces is Russia, right? Not China. Mm-hmm. So the primary concern has to be how to combat Russia. And if Germany wants to rearm to be able to meet that threat, it's going to have to rely on China in the short and even medium term. James, what do you think?
I think so. There are sort of nascent efforts underway in Germany to try and become a bit more self-sufficient on raw materials. If you go down to the Rhinelands in the southwest, you'll meet a lot of startup companies that are trying to sort of increase the amount of mining of lithium and other valuable raw materials. There was some news reports as well recently about a huge raw minerals deposit being discovered, I think, in Saxony. Of course, the huge question is whether any of this is just a drop in the ocean, compared to the raw materials supplies of China. I also think that the deepening strategic partnership, diplomatic, military, political, between Russia and China is a major concern, and there are some security experts who kind of increasingly take the view that this is a sort of Axis-style alliance, actually, and that you can't really talk about one without the other. The main example that they would cite for that would be the use of North Korean conscripts in Ukraine on the Russian side of the fighting. This is a very difficult area for Germany because, as Ulrike alluded to, German businesses they've not just become hooked on, historically, on cheap Russian gas, but also have become sort of hooked on Chinese trade as well. I mean, I did a story about the car industry fairly recently, where sources in the car industry told me that senior people in that industry are just petrified of upsetting Beijing, that their business links with China are absolutely paramount to them. The impression I got is that there is a lot of talk about something called de-risking in the context of the German economy in China. There's a lot of talk about it, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of action on it, because there's kind of a perception that ship has sailed, and that Germany some time ago took the decision, that it was just going to be very dependent on the Chinese economy, and it's perhaps too late to reverse that. So it's a very, very sort of economic discussion, but it certainly has a big link with military issues as well.
One thing I'm really curious about is how much resistance has there been from the German public with this whole rearmament? What's happened to the anti-militaristic sentiment that came out of World War II? And, is there also a cost of living crisis as we're having here? And so resistance to this idea of money being spent on defence, which you might never see tangible results from. It's more of a deterrence rather than the right here, right now economic situation for people.
So to put it kind of in a nutshell, I'd say there also has been a Zeitenwende in the German society's thinking about military and defense. Of course, not 100% of the society. And you could argue that, those let's call them anti-militaristic or anti-military voices. Some of them have gotten even louder. That being said, and I really experienced this in my day-to-day work because, I appear in the media and I've done so in the last 10 years. And so just in terms of who, the kind of feedback you get on the topic and who writes to you and how really shows you that more Germans are now realizing that, well, actually the armed forces are good for something. Not everybody who says we need working armed forces somehow wants to start a war of aggression against our neighbors, but rather, it's about defense and deterrence and defending our allies. And large majorities of the German population have now understood that things have changed, that they need to change, that some of our beliefs over the last few decades were, just wrong or maybe, too optimistic in a way. So that's one part of the equation. Of course, we also have a debate on, should we be spending on defense or on, social spending? The good news for Germany is that contrary to the UK, contrary to France, and contrary really to most European countries, Germany has some money that it can spend just by raising more debt. Because Germany did not raise a lot of debt over the last decades. The famous debt brake that we alluded to briefly. In Germany, it is not quite the equation. If you spend €1 on defense, you're not going to spend it on social spending, but rather, we're just going to raise more debt, which of course, comes with its whole other debate. So it's not quite so difficult as, say, in France or in the UK, where there is just less financial leeway.
My final question, is there any unease at all amongst Europeans of this idea of Germany rearming? And I know that sounds a bit ridiculous, and maybe we are so far removed from that moment post-World War II, but it is a huge shift in the way Europe is ordered. And I'm wondering if you guys have come across any unease in other European countries about this. James, do you want to start?
Yes, I mean, I am, as our listeners are no doubt well aware, not German. So I can only speak to the German perspective and the Polish perspective on this, because I spend a lot of time in Poland as a sort of outsider. When I speak to Germans, they do feel, not all Germans, but many Germans, particularly young Germans, feel very uneasy about the idea of Germany being, as Friedrich Merz put it, back. They want to know what being back exactly means. Some Germans that I've spoken to have expressed concerns that this is not the role that Germany should be playing in Europe, that it should be, yes, financing, supporting Ukraine and NATO allies through essentially sending money. But they feel really uncomfortable about the idea that German soldiers should actually be, sort of out there in uniform on the ground fighting. Some Germans, when I discuss this with them, it is almost an injury to their post-war self-image. This idea that they're going to be, becoming a sort of muscular, kriegstüchtig, war-ready fighting force. I think it doesn't just go back to a sort of World War II. I think it speaks to a country that even after World War II went through an awful lot of trauma, particularly during the Soviet occupation and the Stasi, and it's a country that felt for so many years it was being sort of buffeted around by the winds of history. And I think Germans were kind of exhausted after the end of the sort of fall of the wall, and there was this deep yearning to kind of step back from history and be a passenger in history and not be an active participant in it anymore. I'm not German, so that's me kind of repeating what Germans have sort of said to me and sort of stumbling my way through repeating it. Poland is really nervous about this. German-Polish relations are not great. There is deep anxiety in Poland about whether Germany would actually come to Poland's aid. And I picked up on this when I was in Poland for a story about civil defence a couple of weeks ago, travelling all over Poland, speaking to preppers, people at military schools, just normal Poles. There's this big theme in sort of the Polish political debate about Poland being sort of abandoned, Poland alone, Poland being forced to fend for itself against Russia. The right-wing politicians in Poland particularly sort of are very, very keen on that. So there's a lot of skepticism in Poland about whether, which of course was, infamously, as our listeners are well aware, was invaded by Germany. There's a lot of anxiety about whether they can count on the Germans or indeed other NATO allies to come to their rescue.
Ulrike, is there anything you want to add from European perspective?
Yeah, definitely. So is there unease in other countries? There is some. It does exist, but it is not dominant. And in fact, what I come across more is Europeans that say to Germany, no, please do more, including, by the way, in Poland. And we ran polls on this with the European Council on Foreign Relations where I work, where this comes out. This doesn't mean that there isn't also unease, and James just talked about this, but I think the majority of Europeans actually wants Germany to do more, including in the military realm and on foreign policy. And so this is more welcomed than that there's fear. Overall, I mean, the Europeans really see that Europe needs to do more to defend itself, and Germany is a huge part of it. I mean, let's be honest, yes, the European Union is 27 countries, but when it comes to European defense, what really matters is what Germany does, what France does, what Poland does. And then you can maybe put in, Italy or the Balts and the Nordic countries are important, but, really size, quantity, economic power really matters in this field. And so if Europe wants to be able to defend itself, it needs Germany.
That was the Telegraph's Berlin correspondent James Rothwell and Ulrike Franke, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Now, of course, Germany is not alone in having to tackle Moscow's expansionism. This is a Europe-wide problem, something NATO members are painfully aware of. NATO this week held a defence industry forum to encourage member states to ramp up military spending. Battlelines producer Pete Shevlin spoke to a RUSI analyst attending the forum about why it's so important and who's winning the race to rearm.
I'm Linus Terhorst. I'm with RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, covering defence industry and procurement policy.
Amazing. And you're there today. Tell me those keynotes. What's been interesting today?
NATO's Secretary General, Mark Rutte, there, giving a quick opening speech, outlining, I think, the key points where governments have finally agreed to increase their defence spending. We now need industry to adapt to that new market, going ahead with investments. He said, let's make a deal. Let's invest on the corporate side. And on his side, he will make sure that the increased defence spending is actually going to happen, and therefore the investments will be paying off in the future. Since The Hague, it is now very, very obvious that the governments are committed to increasing their defence spending to 3.5% of their GDP in the next 10 years, and that this is shifting the way industry is behaving in the defence market. We're moving away from investment by contracting towards investment in advance from defence companies who are then rewarded by getting contracts. Mark Rutte outlined that he's willing to make that deal as defence companies are going ahead and investing. He will be willing to convince the governments to walk the talk and spend committed defence budgets.
Would I be under the impression that it's quite a buoyant conference then? There's positivity right now?
Absolutely. I think the conference is buzzing with a sense of optimism going forward, the general sense that demand has much increased, that there is a lot of things to do in all sorts of fields of the industry. We are talking about then if people are going ahead with investments, how is that financed? What roles do banks play in this? What roles does private equity play in this? So these were all questions we covered, down to the really sort of macro level analysis. How do we make sure that governments continue to have the support among the general public for the levels of spending they're just committed to?
And why do you think this forum's important?
I think the most important thing about it is the ability to speak in an open forum, to ensure each other that the analysis in terms of what markets are going through, what policy changes are needed on a variety of levels, both on the national government's level, but also on NATO's level, that these are all vaguely the same. And of course, it's an opportunity for industry to network amongst the various sectors, finance, manufacturing, supply chains, and so on.
Do you get a sense now that there's a new urgency within NATO? Does it feel bolstered?
Absolutely. I think there is a sense of urgency. There is a sense of willingness to do what it takes, both amongst the industry player, but also, and that's probably a little bit new, amongst the bureaucrats who need to implement all of this. And that's true for NATO's procurement agency, that is explicitly asking on this conference industry participants of what it can do better, how it can streamline processes, make procurement and make aggregated procurement easier to achieve.
And talking about those national governments, are there some laggards? Are there some leaders? Tell me about how they're fitting together right now.
Of course, if you look at just the defense budgets and the defense spending plans for the next 10 years, in Europe at least, you will quickly realize that they differ quite a lot in terms of when they're planning to reach the 3.5% defense spending that they have committed. Germany is planning to reach that in 2029. The UK is talking about the 2030s. And Poland is, if you look at the growth in spending, they're quite a lot earlier than many of the other states. And that translates into different markets as well. The Germans are now in a very different position, having to spend all that money, having to push it through their procurement processes, through their bureaucracies, than others. That's not necessarily something to be worried about, something very new. If you look at the Cold War, you always had a discrepancy amongst NATO members in Europe who were closer to the Iron Wall, who felt more threatened and therefore spent more. And the further south, the further west you went, the less urgent was that feeling.
Do you get a sense as well that Germany is now the forerunner?
I'd say Germany has definitely significantly changed its approach to defense, as we all know. The spending is reflecting that. They're planning to have the largest land force in Europe in the next couple of years. Let's see whether that turns into reality. The question is a little bit whether that material leadership is going to translate into a doctrinal or geopolitical leadership, which I think is still very much up in the air. And there we do see, and we have seen over the past couple of years, I'd argue, a thought leadership more in Eastern Europe. The Poles were amongst that, but you certainly also have the Baltics playing a big role in this, in pushing NATO to its new posture vis-a-vis Russia especially. And I think that role will continue to lie with that, because they are so close to the Russians and therefore they have also the political support, frankly, to move ahead.
That was RUSI military analyst Dr. Linus Terhorst speaking to our producer, Pete Shevlin. That's all for today's episode. We'll be back again on Monday. Until then, goodbye. Battlelines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Venetia Rainey, and Roland Oliphant. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battlelines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. To stay on top of all of our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.